So this is the first time I'm standing on stage talking about terroir. It's an interest that I've taken since starting working with CLS Farms. But anyway, so go easy on me. This is all new. This is not a rehashed presentation, but I'm really excited to talk about it because it's, I don't know, it is an exciting topic, but it's also a really non-exhaustive, open-ended topic in American hops right now. So a little bit about me. I've been working in breweries for 14 years in operations from one of the largest craft breweries in the country, so Sierra Nevada, down to very small brew pubs. The smallest brew pub I ever worked at was 300 barrels of annual production. So I've seen all facets of what's going on in the brewing world. I started my path in the hop world 11 years ago when I visited the Yakima Valley for the very first time. And it was during harvest, and I started meeting hop growers, and they had the same level of passion for hops that I did for my beers. And that was pretty much it for me. I fell head over heels for the hop industry. And in 2021, after 9 years of working as the founding brewmaster and director of brewing operations for Three Weavers in Los Angeles, I took a position as a technical advisor for CLS Farms in Yakima, Washington. So I jumped ship from brewing for a little while. I am going back into beer very soon, but it's been a really fun working vacation. And with CLS Farms, I bridge the gap between the brewer and the grower. And I work on quality-focused projects mostly, and I do a shit ton of field sensory during harvest. So I spend all of harvest in Yakima, which is very, very cool. Basic on terroir, we've heard a lot about it today, so I don't really know if I need to get into too much detail on the definition, but really it's a combination of factors: soil, climate, sunlight. It gives agricultural crops distinctive characters. We know this already. It's not something that we talk about in hops very often until maybe the past 6 or 7 years, and certainly more so over the last several. But it's a common and highly important concept in wine grapes. It's used for regional identification and marketing in wine. It is a new concept in hops, and since hops are a very different crop than grapes, we don't always want a wide swing in varietals where hops are concerned, but as brewers, we often do have a preference of where we source our hop varieties and why we want them from that area. It's also a topic around which a lot of work is continuously happening, and like I said, is by no means exhaustive. And it only brings about more questions and conversations as we go deeper into the concept. And that's kind of how I'm gonna end this conversation, as a conversation with questions, because I think there's a lot more to terroir than we're really considering in some of the empirical studies on it. So why do we care about terroir? I mean, the fact that agricultural products can be unique depending on their origin is not a new topic in food, right? We've long held origin-based preferences on things such as cheese, like Parmigiano Reggiano, right? California citrus. And if you love coffee like I do, I mean, coffee has a wide world of origin, whether it's from Ethiopia or Guatemala, Brazil. There's olive oil from Spain, right? So the concept of terroir in food is a very, very familiar one to everyone. But in hops, we'll refer to terroir as differences in chemistry and sensory attributes based off of the location in which they're grown. So it's the complete growing picture, right? It's everything involved there. There's a ton of variables involved, but in hop terroir, like in grapes, a lot of the studies, and so this presentation will focus a lot on what Oregon State University has been studying and kind of defining empirical evidence, bringing it out of the anecdotal on terroir. And so how Shellhammer and his team have looked at it has really been referencing terroir kind of like they look at it in grapes. And so really the two key elements there are climate and the soil composition. But, hop character, it also deserves a conversation around what's happening at the farming level, right? We talk about the cultural, or as Dave was talking about earlier, terroir expression, right? It is definitely more than just the soil and the climate variables, right? So we'll dig into those towards the end of this, right? Practices differ from region to region and even deeper from farm to farm, and so it absolutely impacts the resulting crop. First, we're gonna talk about soil. I didn't think you guys were ready for soil after lunch, but I'm glad there was no beer at lunch, because then some of you would probably be sleeping by now. So there are three main types of soil here, right? You could see There's the sandy soil. It's dry, light, and gritty. It doesn't hold water very well. Most sandy soil is often acidic and it lacks nutrients. But because the soil drains really, really quickly in hot summer months, it warms up and dries out quickly. Silt, which is packed with the nutrients, as it often originates from river sediment, the particles are medium-sized. They retain water pretty well, but drainage can become a problem because of the size of it, and you can see here. Clay, okay, it's very heavy, holds a lot of nutrients, which is good, but it also holds a high amount of water and drains really slowly. So when it comes down to where hops perform best, especially in the United States, and when I talk about the US, I'm referring to the major growing regions, so Washington, Oregon, and actually southern Idaho, not even really northern Idaho. The hops there perform well in a well-drained, deep, sandy, loamy soil. And so loamy soil here is just kind of a mixture of the three things. And when you talk about soil composition, which we'll get to, it's really, you talk about it in a percentage of those three concepts. So as far as like the primary soil in the United States, predominant growing regions, you have the Missoula the flood silts, which are created by ice age glacial lakes that created outburst floods that covered most of eastern Washington, the Columbia River Basin, which also led everything into the Willamette Valley. And then we have Columbia River basalt, which is an area of land mainly eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and western Idaho that was fortified by a lot of repeated volcanic eruptions. So those are the two main classifications of soils that we have there, although there are definitely there's soil that exists from, in alluvial regions and things like that, as we'll see when we get to Oregon. So more about dirt. Soil formation is a complex process. It involves temperature, precipitation, geologic origin, the surface and subsurface nutrients, microorganisms like worms and nematodes, and drainage, right? Soil texture, including how it changes with depth across a soil profile, is one of the key features of a soil and is used extensively for classification and to determine the management strategies of the crop that you're growing in that soil, right? So really the main takeaway of soil is the soil texture on hop growth, right? It's how it can deliver water and retain nutrients for the plant itself. The next environmental thing that we look at when it comes to terroir is climate variables, right? Daylight hours. It's a pretty big one. We know the cycle of the sun dictates hop plant growth, right? Hops are perennial herbaceous plants. They set up shoots in the spring, grow rapidly during the summer, harvest in the early fall. And then latitude plays a really strong role in hop development, and the long summer daylight hours are what cause hops to mature, which is why it's so important in the traditional regions that they fall between like the 35 and 55, right? Temperature, right? Hops thrive in warm and dry environments. They can handle some heat stress. However, too much heat can impact bind maturation. And once cone set has occurred, heat stress can impact yields and resin production in hop cones. This has been seen as recently in the US as 21 and 22, 21 specifically, where we had a really bad heat event in July. And we saw a lot of just really extended maturation on plants that didn't really, and see, they hit the plants before cone set mostly, which is good. Otherwise, we probably would have seen a lot of really, really low yields. But you see impacts on both yield and maturation rates of the hops, in addition to alpha acids and a lot of oil production. The diurnal flux, which is the difference between daily minimum and maximum temperatures, doesn't always vary everywhere. It does vary a lot in the Willamette Valley, where you have some of the growing regions that tend to have breezes flow through that can keep things a little bit cooler at night and hotter during the day. And then also precipitation, where water is really good for hops. But too much rain is definitely a bad thing, especially after cone set on a hop plant. Mature hop cones do not like rain. It can cause a lot of pressure issues on them, in addition to weighing down hop bines and taking down entire trellises. But that's different. That has nothing to do with terroir, but it's still not a good thing. I do think it's worth mentioning the role of metabolites in quality differences in plants. So there's two different types of metabolites that exist within a plant. There's the primary metabolites, right? So responsible for the growth, the development, and the reproduction of the plant: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, oils, things that feed and allow the plant to grow. But secondary metabolites is what we really focus on when we're identifying a lot of the terroir. They're important, but not always essential. Still important to the functioning of the plant. They're compounds made by the plant to aid in the survival and adaptability, and especially in different environments. So let's talk about taking the genetically same hop plant and putting it in different areas. And so over time, you will see a change in the secondary metabolites of this plant that can help in the expression of the terroir of it. So notably, essential oils, the resins and polyphenols in hops, that would be what we focus on in terms of the secondaries. So let's just walk through the 3 main growing regions. Really, when it comes down to it, they're different, but they're not wholly different. I think Washington and Idaho are probably the most similar, and Oregon can diverge a little bit from it. But Washington, Yakima Valley, that's the largest hop growing region in the US, 46 degrees north latitude, 16 hours average daylight in the summertime, so really, really long days. It does get hot, hopefully not too hot, although with climate change, it has been getting hotter over the years. It's a real thing. Arid and desert-like, and relies on irrigation fully. Without irrigation, it just wouldn't exist as a growing region. We sit on predominantly silt loams and sandy loams with a low clay percentage, so really nice drainage and just very, very nice soil for growing in. That's not to say that we aren't doing a lot of nutrient management on our fields, but just saying that it was already a really nice fertile valley to grow in. And it's mainly Missoula silts and the Columbia River basalt. And that's Yakima if you've never seen it. Looks a lot like other places you grow hops, right? We have mountains there. They're not better. They're different. Oh, another mountain. Okay, so Oregon, the Willamette Valley is really, really beautiful. If you've never been there, you should. I mean, I think Yakima is beautiful too, but Willamette is very, it's at 45 degrees latitude. It can mimic a lot of Bavarian-like climate. I mean, maybe not now. Bavaria is changing a lot too with what's been happening with the climate. However, we're not going to get into that right now. But 15 and a half hours of the average sunlight during the summer, so just a little bit less than you see in Yakima. Because of that, harvest tends to start just a little bit earlier than in Yakima and just a little bit earlier than in Yakima. Mild climate, consistent rainfall in the autumn, winter, and spring, but very light in the summer. Very important. Irrigation is more common than it used to be. Willamette Valley used to tout itself on the fact that they didn't really need irrigation, right? But irrigation is necessary for consistency. And so most growers there do employ drip irrigation on their farms. It's predominantly silt loams and sandy loams. They are also benefiting from the Missoula flood silt, but they have Willamette River alluvium because there are farms that sit along the river. So alluvium is basically silt that's carried in through river waters. And it's really high in nutrients. It's great. They grow really beautiful hops, grapes, filberts. It's a hazelnut in that area. Idaho has 2 hop growing regions. There's southern Idaho, which is the Treasure Valley, northern Idaho, which is Bonners Ferry. We're not really going to talk about Bonners Ferry. We're just going to talk about southern Idaho because it's much larger. It does mimic Yakima in a lot of ways, minus the base soil. But long summer days, 15 hours average, because it is a little bit further south than in Oregon. Semi-arid desert climate, it is very dry. They fully rely on irrigation there, and it's predominantly coarse silty loam, volcanic ash, and old alluvium. And so in Idaho, though, the land is always fully prepped to be grown on. I don't think you could have naturally grown these crops on the land had there not been human intervention to remediate the soil into something that was friendly, because it is on Columbia River basalt. There really isn't a ton of silt that occurred naturally a long time ago in Idaho, but they still grow really great hops. So, can terroir influence the chemical composition of hops? The very short answer is yes. And so, for the sake of this presentation, like I said, I'm leaning on OSU's research, and specifically, they did start with Willamette Valley specific research, which I thought was really, really great. I implore you to look up that paper and read it, because they dove in very deep onto these 4 Coleman agriculture farms. They're really great to see, but I was more interested in seeing a difference between 2 states and multiple varieties. So they did a study between Oregon grown and Washington grown Cascade and Mosaic. And, you know, as far as this talk goes, I didn't want to get too crazy on all of the different studies that have been done, because they also did one in Michigan on Chinook. You should look that up as well. It was led by founders and Michigan State University. But really the answer is yes. There is a chemical difference in hops that are grown in Oregon and Washington. If you want, we can talk about the compounds afterwards, but you can see there are a lot of base terpenes on here that differ from Oregon to Washington. And so we'll get into the sensory differences after we go through the compound differences, but really, there are a lot of differences that are occurring between the two. And as far as soil properties go in this study, the greatest variation among them was in the texture of the soil between the two, which really just related to the drainage, right? The water holding capacity, and a few subsurface nutrients. But for the most part, a lot of the composition of the soil of these farms was the same. And so they did 10 samples grown in Oregon and 9 samples grown in Washington. They were taken from a widely varying set of farms across each growing region. And then the chemical composition was analyzed via HPLC and GC. And then the hops were received in a way from the farm in which the farm would grow them. There was no specific expectations placed on the grower on what kind of inputs they expected for the hops to be treated in a specific fashion. So we'll get into that, the farm inputs after this, because I think that there's a lot there. But you can see there's definitely differences between the two in Cascade. And that's the study below if you want to look it up. It was in the ASBC journal. It's also awesome. I mean, all of OSU's work is just top notch. So in terms of Mosaic, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to get into my opinions on this yet, but because of not understanding the different farm inputs occurring on it, it's interesting to see that that's really the only difference that was occurring between the Mosaic in Oregon and the Mosaic in Washington, because I've brewed with Mosaic from both places, and they're both wonderful. And I don't know. I would want to see more data on this and see more exploration, and I hope they continue to work on it, right? But when it comes down to it, what are the impacts on hop sensory attributes? Because they were pretty massive and maybe not in the best way possible. And so they conducted single hop brewing trials at OSU, and they brewed these standardized single hop IPAs fermented with Y yeast 1056, and they brewed them to 40 IBUs of bittering with the stated hop, and then they added 3 grams per liter in the whirlpool and then 8 grams per liter in the dry hop addition. So not quite what you would do in a brewery setting, but they did have a very skilled sensory panel kind of come in, and 1 rub the hops, but 2 do the sensory on the beers themselves. And so the sensory differences come across in both desirable and undesirable ways, which as someone who works at a Washington hop farm, you'll see why I don't really like the data as much. But so sensory differences in Cascade. I mean, Oregon's just got it going on. Although I have to admit, Oregon Cascade is really, really beautiful. I've often selected it blindly. But that's not to say that Washington Cascade isn't spectacular. But Oregon definitely gets all the marks in this study on pluses, because Washington was sweaty, which you actually could see in the chemical composition of the Cascade. Moving on to Mosaic, same, right? Like, I mean, I don't know what's going on in Washington, but Oregon hit much higher notes on the citrus, floral, fruity, tropical, and Washington came in as sweaty, vegetal, and woody. That's not to say that it didn't already have all of those really lovely, that like bouquet of aromatic like beauty that Mosaic has in that hop itself, but like for this study, it's really not that great on what's going on in the state. I demand more information, and actually, so I am a little bit biased. But for Mosaic, they did 8 samples grown in Oregon and 12 grown in Washington. So there was actually quite a bit more being grown in Washington for the sake of the study. So, how impactful are farm practices on aromatic attributes? I think they're pretty big, honestly. So the agronomic elements are often a function of a growing location. And additionally, not all farms are specifically craft-driven when it comes to their harvest decision and hop aroma. I think that that's something to really bring of note, because we still have a lot of very large commercial farms operating in the US that are great, right? All hops are good, some hops are better. And, they may not necessarily be aromatically driven. And so for the purposes of these studies on terroir, I don't think we're getting the bigger picture of things. So starting with irrigation levels and timing have a direct impact on the crop, right? Water stress before and during flowering can decrease resin production and overall cone yields. And then water stress during cone development can significantly impact hop cone yield and quality. Moving to pruning and training, which, properly timing bind training in the spring is incredibly important for maximizing hop yields. And in the spring, the hops emerge from dormancy, and then they can be chemically pruned to encourage like a strong second growth. We're usually not taking the first growth. We like the second growth that comes out of the ground, unless of course things are going in late and you don't have time for pruning, and then you just kind of have the first growth. But because the binds take 3 to 4 weeks to regrow after pruning, the timing is very, very critical. On nutrient management, hops produce an abundance of biomass, and they require an adequate balance of nutrients. Imbalances can lead to a very, very long list of issues like weak and stunted growth, reduced burr and poor cone production, yellowing leaves, and then of course, this all impacts aromatic quality at the end of the line. And this is what makes fertilization input so important. I think the two kind of go together, which of course takes into variables like region, variety, irrigation methods, and soil composition, right? That definitely varies farm to farm. Just a little bit of note of what we do at CLS, because we do things like not a little bit differently. We take a slightly more holistic approach for as large of a farm as we are. But we farm on quite a bit of old hop ground, like hop ground that's been seeing hops being grown on it for 100 years. And that can really, really tax the soil. So we like to look at soil remediation and fertilization as an ongoing process. And we utilize cover cropping on and off season on our fields, just to get ahead of any potential nutrient imbalances, which is not the case for some of our neighbors who I won't call out. But you can see it when comparing hop quality. You absolutely can when you go down a road in Moxie and you go into one field and then you go into another field of the same variety being grown next to each other, and they're completely different. So anyway, it's not our sole method of nutrient management, but it does make a difference. Harvest timing, also crucially important. I think maybe the most important thing in terroir. It's specifically when it comes to aromatic development, right? It differs by hop variety. Every variety has its own picking window that can range from just a couple of days to well over a week, 10 days plus, right? As you see here in Nelson and as we see on our farm with El Dorado. But you see massive aromatic variation within these windows, right? So there are multiple techniques for determining hop maturity and when they're ready to harvest. So some farms rely on dry matter, others rely on field sensory. Some are getting very technical right now and running terpene and thiol analysis out of the field, and some do a combination of those things. But then there's also room for a grower's preference on what they perceive as proper aroma of a variety, right? And sometimes also you just need to pick the hop because there's room in your schedule and you got to get it out of the field. So that definitely comes into play when you come to the overall management of a farm, especially a large one. So, then there's drying, and then there's storage, and then there's processing, and there's just a lot of variables that come into it, right? At CLS, we lean on sensory as our indicator when a variety is mature. That's solely what we do right now. We don't actually run any dry matters in the field. They're great. Dave just talked about this. They don't really matter. They don't matter. If the hop doesn't smell right, don't pick it. So, but in the 2023 crop year, we're actually going to be utilizing a local lab services to start monitoring terpene and thiol development in the field with our two largest crops, which are Centennial and El Dorado. I think we know that what we do with sensory is right, but we want to actually put some empirical evidence behind that, and but also to get just a better understanding of what's happening in the field and when it's happening. And then local variation, and this is what I talk about when you look at just a farm moving from field to field, right? There could be more irrigation on one side of the field versus the other. The wind could hit one side a little bit more. But then also when it's picked, if it's a very large lot, it could take a little while to get to the other side. So, terroir and the brewer. I think that, when it comes down to it, hops are being grown for brewers, right? We're the primary consumer. Brewing preference is paramount for hop selection. We usually know what we're looking for from variety to variety. I think most people in this room are probably keenly attuned to what kind of hops are going into their beers, right? And sometimes that comes in the form of regional preference, depending on the variety. I know a lot of people in this room have pretty firmly held beliefs and opinions on where they get certain varieties of hops from. But that also leads to differentiation, right? This complements regional identity very closely. And using terroir as marketing, there can be a value add of local, different, and unique depending on regional and local variation. This creates a natural variation in aroma that can be seen as positive rather than a flaw. It gives us greater options as brewers and as creators, because I think at the core that's what we really are. And we may all brew with Mosaic, but the chances of our Mosaic being identical is pretty slim. So it's similar, yes, but it's not identical. And I don't know, we'll get into why terroir can also maybe be not the greatest thing. I've talked about this concept for a really long time. It's ingrained in who I am as a brewer, but a deeper connection to the farm, right? I think that the concept of terroir does bring you closer to the farm. Year after year, I've blindly selected the same lots from the same farms, like blindly. I'm gonna say that honestly, to the point where I just stopped doing blind selection and I would go to the farm and do direct business with them. But I mean, what is it that they're doing different, you know? And it may not be in terms of being better, but different in a way that excites me more as a brewer about their hops. And like, what are they doing that makes me more excited about their hops than what another farm is doing? And so the benefit of this communication between the brewer and the grower is not only one-sided, right? It's mutual. And the more that we communicate with growers, the more they learn about what we are looking for. And that in turn directly impacts the operation. And now that I work on the growing side, I've seen that firsthand. So please keep that line of communication open, because I think it's crucially important. So there are risks involved in focusing on terroir. The studies are still very young. You know, I think that the OSU studies are really, really great, but farm impacts are far more important. But then there's the better versus the worse mentality. As you said, that we have mountains. They're not better. They're mountains too. This can pit some sort of competition between growers and one grower's hop being better than the other, and I don't think that that's necessarily the case. So we have to be really, really careful on how we talk about hops from different places to make sure that, like, the rising tide lifts all ships sort of situation, because I've definitely seen this act out in a negative, and I don't really want to see that happen, because all hops are good, right? And then, yeah, really on the study, the risks of these studies is that the farm inputs outweigh the regional differences between terroir from region to region. So I have some questions for you. But first, these are for what the research that I've done on terroir, other than talking to growers, and I could name out a bunch of them, but it would take a really long time. These are the 4 institutions that I think have really spearheaded a lot of the empirical data behind what's going on in American hop terroir studies. So OSU, Coleman Ag, Michigan State, and Founders, really awesome. None of them are here, but thank you. So questions, right? These are my questions to you. And I want someone to answer them. Please don't, I know it's like right after lunch, some of you are kind of sleepy. But does terroir matter to you as a brewer, and why? Someone, before I call on you. No? But why? Who said that? Raise your hand. Why? Why does local matter to you? Is it better? Do you market it as local?
Well, for starters, I'm currently brewing for myself, so that probably influences the decision. It's not a commercial operation. But also, I mean, New Zealand is far away from just about everywhere else that grows hops.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't have to be shipped here, I mean, there's an environment impact to that as well. It's like something's grown here, and especially if it's good.
Well, I agree with you, right? The conversation is by no means on New Zealand hop terroir, because I think that this country has a very special terroir when it comes to hops it's seen in the varieties and the aromas coming out of it here, right? But why is it important, right? Like, why does it matter, especially in operations that rely on consistency? You know, does it really matter where it comes from, or does it matter what it smells like? Do you care, right? Anyone else want to tell me why they care about terroir? Because I really want to know. Yeah.
Identity.
You what?
Identity.
Identity, for
so
sure.
I suppose, Cascade is an identity, but then so is a farm, but then so is a block. Like it's something more specific that we can align with that makes one particular beer or brewery more special. It's more story, it's more connected to a farm or a place.
Yeah.
It's more than just Cascade.
Yeah, I agree. So let me ask you about Cascade, because I've seen a lot of Cascade grown in super non-traditional regions. I mean, Cascade is grown here. Cascade is grown in Australia. I've seen Cascade grown in Brazil, Florida. They grow hops in Florida, which is crazy. I live right outside of Ohio now. They grow Cascade in Ohio. How far can aromatic character swing before it's no longer that variety anymore? And there's a really simple answer to this, right? If it's genetically Cascade, it is Cascade. But as a brewer, I mean, are you going to be like, we're using Cascade in our beer, and it's like the peachiest, like, I've had stone fruit forward Cascade before, which we do not grow in the Pacific Northwest. How far can you let something wander, right, before you change its name or call it something completely different? No? No one? You just don't care? You're like, I don't care, give it to me, I want the smells? It's fine. It's totally fine with me. But yeah, I mean, what about when you look at non-traditional hop growing regions that are growing these things? And in the US, they really only grow public varieties. There aren't a lot of proprietaries that are being let out into these non-traditional regions. Michigan is now considered fairly traditional, where they're growing a lot of things. Hops grow very differently in Michigan. They smell very differently than what we grow in the Pacific Northwest, but it's still considered traditional. But like, what about when you're getting a different aroma because the growing conditions are less than ideal? Does that make it better? Or does that just make it different? Are we being different for the sake of being different, not different for the sake of being better? No? Jeremy?
Thinking about innovation is really about finding new opportunities. And so I think from an innovation standpoint, terroir is important. I think you've mentioned climate change a few times. I think from a supply chain standpoint, terroir is interesting in having hops from different areas to help with what may happen in the future. But yeah, if it's no longer Cascade,
It's genetically Cascade.
but if it no longer has those properties, it's
Right.
almost like a different hop.
It throws the Cascade Cup done by the Hop Quality Group right out the window, right? Which a grower from Colorado won this year, first time ever. So non-traditional hop growing region. And then, okay, my last question, because I am running out of time. Is it the dirt or is it the grower? Right? And this is in the US, I'm not talking about New Zealand, okay? You guys are very special flowers, okay? I love you all. But really, is it the, huh?
Can it be both?
It can be, but what's more impactful? You can have a really shitty grower on great dirt. And then what happens? You don't get great hops from shitty growers, you know? Right? Just give really good dirt to a shitty grower. That's like a really bad reality TV show waiting to happen. Anyway, that's it from me. If you have any questions, that's my email address. You can yell at me. I like being yelled at sometimes. I might yell back at you. And I like geeking out about hops from time to time. Does anyone have any questions?
Alex asked you, you asked her. Are you scared though?
That's fine. It wouldn't be the first time. Yes, Laura?
Would considerations of smoke taint be part of the identity of a region? Is that something that's
I mean, look, if you want to talk about 21 and 22 crop years, maybe. You know, it could definitely be considerations for future years on whether or not you expand your farm in that region, or if you try and find somewhere else that isn't constantly on fire. This year, luckily, we were very fortunate with fires in Washington and Oregon. There were some in Idaho, but I don't think they really had any issues with smoke taint. So there was one day in the valley this year, though, where it was like a Sunday, and anyone who was at harvest this year or lives in Yakima, I'm sure probably sure went outside like I did and was like, holy fuck, what's going on? But it cleared up the next day and we were good. We could unclench our buttholes that day. Because we've seen a lot of latent expression of smoke taint in hops that were passed in sensory through brokers and some of the best growers, best brokers, best brewers in the world, passing them only to, I mean, I'm looking at Jeremy right now too, because I think they had an issue with some latent smoke expression in pellets. He wasn't the only brewery, but these are things that totally passed all of our sensory going in. We found it later in the year. We still don't know why that's happening. So if anyone here is doing any smoke studies, we can talk about that too. But that's a completely different topic. But yes, potentially, which is why non-traditional hop growing regions, and I wasn't trying to like shit on them at all. I think it's really important to grow in these non-traditional regions because they may become more traditional in the future as the climate continues to change. Obviously, the daylight hours won't be a thing, but if you look at Florida, they're actually supplementing with LEDs on the top wires. It's crazy. They do 2 harvests a year and they supplement with lighting. Yeah. I implore you to look more into also to just subtropical hop growing. They're doing it in Brazil as well. It's fascinating. I think they're crazy, but it's fascinating nonetheless. Anyway, if there's no more questions, thank you.